My name is KIRILL Gerstein, and you've tuned into the online seminar KIRILL Gerstein Invites at the Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule in Berlin, hosted by our Eisler Lab. And I'm delighted to welcome composer and conductor and writer Matthew Aucoin. I have read his recent very excellent article in the New York Review of Books about Boulez, or critiquing Boulez, something that we might speak about towards the end. And of course, I know Matthew's music and conducting. I'm sure some of you will check all of those things after today's seminar. And Matthew offered this, I think, fantastic topic, and with a tongue-in-cheek title, Firewood and the Fire. And I think the intersection of music and words and the creative tension that they generate is a most interesting topic. So I'm delighted that you are all here. I'm delighted that Matthew is here and agreed to talk to us. And welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Kirill. Really good to be here. So let's dive in. I'm really delighted that Kirill invited me to quite an amazing list of participants so far in this series. So I hope I have something to offer. I think a lot about the connection between words and music because I work in opera a lot. A new opera premiered, believe it or not, it premiered this year, just before opera became, illegal and unsanitary and all of that. So I thought I would delve into this very tense, productive relationship between text and music, because I think it's a bit more complicated than it's sometimes made out to be, especially when musicians learn about poetry. The title of today's talk is The Firewood and the Fire, because I tend to think of the text as the firewood and the music is the fire. And there's a certain sacrificial offering quality to what happens to poetry when it is set to music. And I thought I would begin by sharing an idea of mine. I'm probably completely crazy, and this is a very personal way of understanding poetry. But given that there are probably a lot of musicians watching today, some of you may feel similarly. So basically, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we think of music in time signatures, and we think of poetry usually in meters. And I'm a musician, and so of course I think that the musical way of approaching it is simply superior. And so what I want to begin by proposing is that poetry actually is in time signatures as well, and that in any piece of music that features a text, the poetry has a time signature and the music has a time signature, and those two things are often different, and they often engage with each other at an angle, and that's what makes the music come alive. So what is the real difference between meters and time signatures to start with? Well, at least in English, we learn about meters in terms of stresses, accents, the basic rhythm of the English language, we are taught, is iambic pentameter. So it's supposed to be a 5-beat line, da-dun, 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 da-da, da-dun, 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 da-da. What I feel as a musician immediately is, what about the rests? There are rests here. But the curious thing is that the language of poetic meters has no way of acknowledging rests. It feels like this extraordinarily basic thing. So that's one problem. There's no way of acknowledging silence as a rhythmic presence, which any musician knows it's totally essential to the texture. The other issue for me with meter is that there's no difference between a beat and a stress. That is, there's no difference between a marker in time and an accent. So what happens is you look sort of for these heavy syllables. And of course, musicians know a beat is not the same thing as an accent. An accent can fall on an offbeat, and nonetheless, there is this matrix that underlies the whole and gives it a shape. But it doesn't mean that the strong things have to fall always in the same places. So to begin with, Kirill, if we could go to the PDFs, I want to take the most familiar, obvious example that I could possibly have picked. Shakespeare's probably most familiar sonnet, sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And just to read the first quatrain in a kind of natural way. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Now, Kirill, if we could go to the next slide.
Yeah.
This is kind of the bad version. If we take iambic pentameter very literally, where it says it has to be ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And anyone can tell, obviously, that this is not how we speak. And actually, some of the lines that are accented, or the syllables that are accented, actually aren't accented. You don't say, shall I, it's shall I. You don't say, to, compare thee to a summer. So the whole idea of these stresses is inaccurate already. The other thing is the notion that it's 5 beats. Could we go to the next slide? If we try to imagine in a very literal way that 5 beats translates to a kind of 5/4, we get, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, rough winds do shake. I think any musician feels that there's usually a pause after each line, and it's not a pause of a random length, it's a pause of what we would say maybe a quarter note. So if we go to the next slide, which is also pretty crude, but it's maybe a little bit more accurate. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake. So we see this version that takes into account that actually there's a quarter note breath at the end of every line of pentameter. And if you were going to conduct this poetry, I don't know why you would do that, but if someone were conducting a Shakespeare poem, if they're a good conductor, they probably wouldn't beat every single beat. You know, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Da, 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 da. You'd probably lead it in 3. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. So it's kind of in 3/2. All of this is to suggest that the basic thing that we English language speakers are taught, that the basic line of the English language is a 5-beat line, is not quite accurate. And I think we can learn a lot by approaching it as a musician might, and to say, actually, there's a hidden 6th beat, and what that means is that it's in 6, or more accurately, it's in 3. So the basic rhythm of our language is actually a big 3 rather than a clipped 5. And what someone like Shakespeare does, and what makes this kind of rhythm so flexible, is that in his plays, he will switch back and forth between being in 3/2 and being in 5/4, so to speak. Sometimes you want this sense of a breath, and sometimes you want the asymmetry of the lines kind of spilling over and connecting to each other. But I find that that is more the exception than the rule, that the feeling of a pentameter actually being in 5 is kind of rare. So why do I begin this talk with with this poetic example, it's because I think that in any piece of music that sets a text, it's helpful to approach it through this lens of what is the time signature of the text. Might be quite irregular, might be quite regular. And then what is the time signature, so to speak, of the music? And they're almost never, with a good composer anyway, they're almost never the same thing. And I would love now to go to the next example, which is my personal favorite example of a text and the music seeming to go head to head, but actually making friends in a beautiful way. Stravinsky's opera, The Rake's Progress, which has a libretto by W.H. Auden and his partner in crime and art and life, Chester Coleman. The reason that I think this is kind of the most beautiful example imaginable is that both Auden and Stravinsky have an unusually clear-cut quality to their art. They both seem kind of chiseled in stone. They speak extraordinarily clearly, and so there's really nowhere to hide in what each one is up to rhythmically. So I want to take a look at what Auden and Coleman wrote, and then what Stravinsky did to it in the musical setting. This is an aria that the protagonist, Tom Rakewell, sings when he is he's arrived in London. He's at a whorehouse. He's left his fiancée behind, and he's begun this decline down this slippery slope of dissolution. And he sings this strikingly mournful and sad aria when he's asked by the whores and his devilish guide Nick Shadow to sing something for the group. He sings this very sad aria about giving up love, as he's just done. And to kind of apply this frame of time signatures to the poem, I think we would say that it's in 4/4 and there are no pickups. And we begin right on the downbeat in a way. It's love too frequently betrayed for some plausible desire or the world's enchanted fire, and so on. It's a pretty obvious rhythm. And what I love about what Stravinsky does to it, and he does this pretty much at every moment through the opera, is that he literally turns it on its head at every single moment. So everything that's an on-beat in Auden becomes an offbeat in Stravinsky. Maybe we should go to the score, and I'll get my paper copy of the score here as well. So you can see he begins on an offbeat. Love too frequently betrayed. And as the aria goes on, everything that is an onbeat in Auden is an off, and vice versa. Until we get to this climactic part. Maybe we could go back to the poem text just for reference. You'll see near the end of each stanza, there's weeping, weeping, and then dying, dying, which is a different kind of line from the others. And that's the only place that Stravinsky decides to line it up and to have the musical stresses align with the poetic ones. And before we listen, I think we should listen through the aria. The effect that I find so special here is that you can hear the ghost of the original pattern of the poetry in the music in a way. It's sort of like a hemiola, you know, in the way that with a rhythmic hemiola, you kind of hear two things at once. You hear one time signature within another. In the same way, because Auden's prosody is so clear, you can kind of hear the ghost of it in Stravinsky's music, and it gives the whole thing this kind of shimmy. So let's listen to at least a bit of this fabulous aria sung by Jerry Hadley.
Let me just make sure that I'm also sharing the sound. One second. Sure. So, and that the video clip will show better. There we go.
So that's one, I think, good example. We've got one more from Rake's Progress that I'll just mention in passing, because Stravinsky does it pretty much everywhere. You can open anywhere in the score. I think the next slide we've got here is another example. But actually, just to speak more generally, you know, I worked with a pianist once who had worked with Stravinsky near the end of his life on a production of the Rake's Progress. And Stravinsky said the most revealing thing. Apparently, I'm of course relating it secondhand. But he said, if you're going to do the Rake's Progress well, you basically have to do two things. One is that every tempo is a dance tempo. And the other is don't mispronounce the words even when the rhythm seems to ask you to. Because the temptation when you see the way Stravinsky turns Auden on his head or refracts it or cracks it open or whatever, the temptation is to lean into that and to make it sound kind of grotesque. The very first music in the opera is the words, "The woods are green," badum badum, but it is set with the word "the" on the downbeat. So it can sound really silly. You can sort of go, "The woods are green," and it sounds like, oh God, Stravinsky was a Russian speaker. He didn't know what he was doing setting English. But that's absolutely, with no offense, Kirill, that's absolutely not what is happening. He just says, sing it, forget that it's a downbeat, sing "the woods are green," and do that throughout the whole piece. And the whole thing kind of has this, there's actually quite sexy flow to it. Before we go on to anything else, I wonder, Kirill, if we should take any questions so far, or
no, I think
I
mean, I can only judge by myself, but I think we're following in rapt attention, and it's very fascinating. So I think you should just please do go on.
Okay, cool. Well, let's go on then. So with a composer like Stravinsky, it's obvious. It's obvious that something is being twisted. It's there in every aspect of his music, really, in the harmonies and the rhythms. But what I want to suggest is that this relationship, this kind of inherent rhythmic tension in any really good musical text setting, goes way farther back. And you can find it even in what we think of as very kind of meat and potatoes opera. And so I want to talk a bit about two very familiar opera composers, Verdi and Mozart, before talking a bit about how I try to engage with this kind of thing myself when I write music. And in Verdi, it's actually every bit as pronounced as it is in Stravinsky, which is kind of surprising. A very common rhythm in Italian libretti is called a decasillabo, which basically means a 10-syllable line, but really it means the big stress is on the 10th syllable, and it can be 9 to 11 syllables. And if we could go to the text of the Verdi aria. Great, so this is the beginning of a very famous aria from Rigoletto. And when it's spoken, this kind of meter is basically in 12/8, I would suggest, with a pickup. Cortigiani, vil razza dannata, per qual prezzo vendeste il mio bene, a voi nulla per loro sconviene, ma mia figlia impagabil tesor. And sort of inelegantly put, this is the rhythm of the Mexican hat dance. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Thanks, Kirill. So this is kind of a monstrosity, but it's cortigiani vil razza dannata, per qual prezzo vendeste il mio bene. And what's really funny is that there is that sharp ending, even in the verse forms. So of course, if a composer were to do what the text wanted, you would end up writing the Mexican hat dance every time. And this is a form that is all over the place in Verdi. The famous chorus va pensiero sull'ali dorata. Etc. And in every case, he's got to do something about it. He's got to change the rhythm. And in this aria, in Rigoletto, it's really amazing what he does. Kirill, could we go to the score, which is the next slide? There is a triplet or sextuplet related motion, but it's in the orchestra. It's this kind of heaving, etc. And the vocal line is in very heavy duples against that. Cortigiani, vil razza dannata. And if you look and you remember what the rhythm of the text is by itself, cortigiani, vil razza dannata. Thank you. Basically, he's respecting the really big stresses, but he's putting this fabulous kind of pressure on it at the same time, so that and this is of course a moment where Rigoletto is super desperate. His daughter has been abducted. He's talking to the men who he knows have abducted her. And so there's this feeling that he's pushing, he's on a leash almost, and he's pushing against this leash in the orchestra that holds him in place. And so there's this extraordinary tension in the aria, which ultimately explodes and bursts open before kind of melting into an adagio. So even, the most, in a way, mainstream of opera composers, but also one of the best text setters, is kind of doing the same sort of thing that Stravinsky is, though maybe not to the same degree. And a slightly different case, and here we're going to go beyond just the rhythm and start getting more into big questions of completely changing a text's meaning. I would love to go now to an example from a Mozart opera. I know, Kirill, you had a request for Mozart operas for this, and I'm very glad to oblige.
Well, one of the things which was, I think, also in the mail, that in the invitation that I sent to everybody, was you talking about Mozart opera on Zsolt Bognar's interview series, and then in fact he's in the audience today as well, I can see, which is lovely. And everybody who hasn't watched that wonderful excerpt can find the link either directly on YouTube or in my mail and see you talking there, which I find is just an incredibly captivating way of talking about music. So I'm delighted that you talk more about Mozart and Verdi and Stravinsky and yourself.
Well, thanks. Well, this is another example from Figaro to start with. I think one of the most important things for composers who want to engage with text is you can take any piece that's out there, any piece that you love, and it's a good exercise to kind of defamiliarize yourself from the music. This particular piece, this duet, I mean, it's one of the most familiar pieces. It was in the Shawshank Redemption, etc. But what you want to do as a composer is to look at what was Mozart looking at when he was handed the libretto, and what does that process entail, and what worked and what was so magical about it. And a thing that's remarkable about this duet from the third act of Figaro is that the atmosphere, the tone, the affect of the text is very different from what the affect of the music is. And I want to look at why Mozart made the decisions that he did, and also the trap that a more mediocre composer might have fallen into. So for anybody who's not familiar with the plot, we are deep into the opera at this point, and Count Almaviva, who is a philandering, unfaithful husband who is very sweet on his maid Susanna, he's about to be caught in a trap because Susanna is in fact very close with his wife, the Countess, and they have formed an alliance to try to expose his duplicity, his unfaithfulness, his untrustworthiness. And in this scene, Susanna and the Countess are plotting against him. They're figuring out a letter. They're writing a letter that is a trap. It's a lure to bring the Count out to the garden and meet a woman that he thinks is Susanna, but it will actually end up being the Countess in disguise. So basically what it sounds like is bedroom comedy. You know, it sounds like farce. It does not sound especially sublime or special if you just describe what's happening. And if you look at the text of this fabulous duet, it's only 4 lines. It's 4 very short lines that are kind of, they're a tease. Che soave zeffiretto questa sera spirerà sotto I pini del boschetto e già il resto capirà. So it's kind of a seduction, you know, a sweet little breeze is going to blow this evening out in the grove. And by that they mean, I'm going to be there. Will you meet me? And so it doesn't seem like it would be solemn. It doesn't seem like it would be especially beautiful. It would probably be playful and mischievous and a little bit malicious, maybe. So I took the huge liberty of trying to imagine what a lesser composer in the late 18th century might have done with this scene. Yeah, if we go to the next slide, this is what I think of as the bad version of Che soave zeffiretto. It's totally my invention, and it's just kind of, you know, this is what a lesser composer would have done with it. Soave zeffiretto, questa sera spirerà sotto I pini del boschetto, e il resto capirà, e il resto capirà. That's what people would have been expecting from this scene, that it would be light, it would be playful. You know? Mozart wrote duets like that a bajillion times, but instead, he decides that this moment where these 2 women who are both in different ways trapped, the Countess is trapped in a loveless or in a way decaying marriage, and Susanna is trapped because of her class. She's a servant, she's not as free. Both of these women kind of trail off into their own world. And instead of taking the text at face value and just saying, well, this is a sex comedy, it's going to be playful and mean, he allows you to perceive that they're imagining what this kind of encounter would have meant back when life was better, when things were more innocent. Maybe they had encounters like this, you know, beneath the pine trees in a happier time. Actually, I think I forgot the score excerpt from Figaro, but I did send along a recording, so I know it's quite familiar, but why don't we listen to, let's call it the good version of the real Act 3 duet.
Here we go.
Canzonetta sull'aria, sull'aria, che soave zeffiretto, questa sera spirerà
So yeah, I think it's a case of taking it quite seriously, even when the text did not seem to be asking for it. It's always those unexpected sublime moments that for me sort of set Mozart apart. There's one more Mozart example that I feel like is helpful, and these are kind of two contrasting examples from Zauberflöte, because it's not totally true that you always resist the time signature of the poetry. You can go with it, but typically if you go with the time signature of the poetry, the effect is going to be either naive or clunky, or sort of speech-like. And Zauberflöte is a really good example of this because it's a folk story in a way. And you have characters like Papageno, who is a bird catcher and who is a man of the people, let's say. He's easygoing, informal, unpretentious. And then you have a character like Tamino, who is apparently a prince. We don't really know of what, but he's higher born in the world of the piece. And if you look at the way that these two arias, the first arias of each of these characters begin, the poetry, the rhythm of the poetry is quite similar. And I'm probably talking to a lot of German speakers, so someone might correct me. But the rhythm of Der Vogelfänger bin ich ja, stets lustig, heißer Hopsasa. Ich, Vogelfänger, bin bekannt bei alt und jung im ganzen Land, is pretty similar to Dies Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön, wie noch kein Auge je gesehen. Ich fühle es, wie dies Götterbild mein Herz mit neuer Regung füllt. But there's a crucial difference in the way that the two are musicalized. In the first case, and yeah, if we could go to the score, it's followed very literally. The rhythm of the text is basically with a couple of little ornaments. It's the same in the Der Vogelfänger bin ich ja stets lustig, heiser Hopsasa. It's basically the same as the spoken rhythm. Ich, Vogelfänger, bin bekannt bei alt und jung im ganzen Land, etc. And then Tamino's aria, which is the next score excerpt, even though the poetry looks exactly the same on the page, Mozart stretches it beyond recognition and gives it a completely different rhythm. Dies Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön, etc. So one syllable does a lot of the heavy lifting and makes it cantabile, and it has a completely different shape. And this has to do with the personality and the social status of the characters. It's invisible in the poetry and very visible, audible, palpable in the music. So that we've come to the end of the examples from older music and amazing music. And KIRILL, I'm happy to chat about what we've covered so far, or to talk a bit about my own attempt to wrestle with this kind of challenge.
I think now that you've set the scene, and not only set the scene, but really also the stage, I think it would be most interesting to see sort of what personalized conclusions you draw in implementing these thoughts in your textures, and then we can jump around and ask questions and possibly come back to music, new and old.
Sounds good. So I want to deal with a couple of examples from a song cycle that I wrote a few years ago based on poems by James Merrill. I've written music to my own texts, as well as to texts old and new. This most recent opera is a collaboration with the playwright Sarah Rule. And it's different every time. I think the hardest by far is dealing with your own text. This is a little bit the Wagner problem. To pick a very famous example, because Wagner, I love Wagner's music, but the challenge is it's all him. It's really all him, and you get a gigantic dose of Richard Wagner, the man, whenever you listen to the music, because it's the text, the philosophy, it's everything in this this goulash. And what is nice when you're writing music with somebody else's text is that they kind of exert a certain pressure on you. And it changes the music that you write. It changes, of course, it's a chemical thing. The substance that you engage with will have a chemical effect on you. And I picked a couple of examples from Merrill, a really great late 20th century American poet, in part because I think Merrill is sort of like the spiritual descendant of W.H. Auden in a certain way. And given that we looked at Auden's work with Stravinsky, it might make sense to look at Merrill. So I picked two examples. One of them is kind of sweeter, and there's a clearer relationship between the music and how the text looks on the page. And another one, it's much more violent, and there's a much clearer rupture between what is there on the page and what you hear. So this poem, The Kimono, is a very kind of melancholy, it's a love song for a relationship that's not going especially well. And Merrill writes it in this kind of variant on what we call ballad meter, the ballad rhythm. And to go back to the original idea here, typically we're taught that ballad meter is alternating lines of 4 stresses and 3. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Ba-dum, 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 ba-da, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And of course, any musician would say, well, that's 2 bars of 4/4 with a rest, every 2 bars. That's the subtexture here, but Merrill varies it. When I returned from Lover's Lane, my hair was white as snow. Joy, incomprehension, pain, I'd seen like seasons come and go. How I got home again, frozen half dead, perhaps you know. And the poem goes on to there's this line that haunts me, really haunts me. Desires ungratified persist from one life to the next. Really haunting line that, whatever we don't take care of, whatever we don't wrap up in this lifetime gets transformed. It's like ghosts or karma or however you want to think about it, but it's a disturbing thought. And Merrill has this amazing quality of using sometimes contemporary language within very old verse forms. It's very elaborate. He loves to kind of surprise you with a contemporary reference. Suddenly you're inside of a horrible, bright shopping mall in the 1990s or whatever, in the middle of what feels like this grand, poetry. And I kind of relate to that in a way, musically, that I love working with schemas that you think but then suddenly it's behaving in a different way than you might expect. So if we could go for a second to the score. So yeah, there's a brief piano intro which you'll hear on the recording, but the basic thing that I wanted to do with the text was to change the kind of 4/4 of the ballad meter into some kind of triple rhythm to create this feeling of cycles and seasons and lifetimes passing. So there's this very kind of melting quality to the vocal line. And we do have a recording, a live recording of the song. So I'd love to just play the first, minute or two of that. I'll wave when we've heard enough. Cool.
Oh, or can we hear it to the end? Do you mind?
I don't mind, no.
You hide a smile and quote a text. Consuming pride. stream, watered with rushes. I've run blue.
I think I wrote all those left-hand optional things for for when I play it myself. You wouldn't have any problem, Carol.
Bravo. Well, it's a beautiful work.
It's, you know, the text and the music are mostly pretty good friends in this piece. I did want to catch, as I mentioned, the cyclical quality, the sense of something kind of fleeting and passing away. And there is something that happens. It's a couple of pages in, but you know, everyone probably noticed. Maybe it's on the third page, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, Kirill. That there's a, let's see, keep going. And let's keep going. It's probably on the 5th page or so then. That there's a moment where the piece kind of grinds to a halt. There it is, you know, getting into bar 46, which feels to me like it's kind of implied in the poem that this kind of anger flushes up, and I think sometimes it's music's job to finish the sentence and go where, say the things that the text can't say. And so it felt like we needed to kind of grind our gears for a second in a way and be in this very stuck place. And then if we scroll down just a hair more, couple more systems, then eventually after, yeah, right after this descent, we eventually break and find our way back in a way to the beginning. So it's one of the gentler kind of connections. I want to, for my last example, look at a much tenser relationship. If we could scroll down to the poem right after this song. So this song cycle, Merrill songs, which I wrote probably 5 years ago now. There was one song that just would not play nicely with the others. It wanted to be a bigger piece, both in terms of its length and in terms of its instrumentation. And so it was removed from the cycle, and only now actually I'm returning to it and arranging it for chamber orchestra. It's a much darker poem of Merrill's. Merrill passed away from complications related to AIDS in the mid-1990s. And he wrote this amazing and disturbing poem called Tony Ending the Life, which is theoretically about a friend of his who was dying of the disease. But it's clearly about himself. Merrill has said elsewhere that whenever you use the word you in a poem, as you can see he does right here, you really means I, whereas when you use the word I, it's usually someone else, which I think is really true. And so he's describing this very disturbing scene. His friend is sick, and he has stumbled out into the street in Greece where he lives. He's struck his face, and so he's bleeding a little bit. He maybe tried to take a bunch of pills with ouzo, with alcohol, as the poem says. And he describes paramedics, medical professionals coming to get him, and they seem to be in protective gear. It's kind of haunting, especially this year, with all we've seen around the world of the impacts of the COVID pandemic. But you know, in the early days, people didn't know how contagious or in what ways AIDS might have been contagious, and so there's this frightening scene of kind of people in space suits, and it's delirious. I'll just read this excerpt from the text. You stumbled forth into the glare, blood-red ribbon where you struck your face. Pills washed down with ouzo hadn't worked. Now, while the whole street buzzed and lurked, the paramedics left you there, returning costumed for a walk in space. The nurse thrust forms at you to sign, then flung away her tainted pen. Lie back now in that heat older than time, whose golden regimen still makes the palm grow tall and the date sweet. Come, a last sip of wine. I think that's about as far as the music goes. So it's a lot's going on here. In that second stanza, you know, this nurse in protective gear is kind of thrusting forms for him to sign and then throwing the pen away as if it's radioactive. And then there's this image of lying back in the sunlight, you know, the heat that's older than time, the sun itself. There's this contrast that's there between the horrible modern spacesuits and this horrible modern disease, and this ancient strength and energy, the palm tree, the date, wine being ripened. And so I wanted to catch the contrasts in this text, and also the implied contrasts, the feeling of revulsion and sort of jerkiness in the first part, as well as this kind of hallucinatory trance state in sunlight description. So let's go to the score if we can. I unfortunately don't have an audio recording for this one because
you just have to play some of it.
Right, I'll have to fake my way through it in a way, because it's gonna be in a chamber orchestra version. I think anybody who's a pianist can tell that this doesn't really want to be solo piano. It wants to be something more. Could we actually go to the next page? So, yeah, rather than completely botching it, I'm to let people look at it, and I'll play some bits. So there's this kind of very quick gesture of the pills didn't work. And then as he's imagining kind of the activity of the street, there's this very layered and this is really what I wanted to get into. The image of the nurse kind of thrusting the forms. I wanted a kind of motion that interrupted itself constantly. Oh, actually, this is on the next page. The nurse thrust forms at you to sign. Great. And the music kind of restarts in a way every bar. And so on, so that every downbeat is kind of a rupture. And then near the end of this section, you can show the next system, there's this abrupt change into the very different kind of musical motion. Whose golden regimen still makes the palm grow tall and the date sweet. So there's this anyway, there's this really sharp contrast between a music that interrupts itself constantly and a feeling of a very long phrase and almost hallucinatory haze to it. So in a way, this is it's an old piece, but it's also a piece that doesn't exist yet. It'll probably come to life as soon as concerts can happen on this side of the ocean. Anyway, I know I just threw a whole lot at you, so I'm happy to open the floor.
Yes, I think something just in the last minute or so, the sound of your voice somehow got softer, but maybe it was just from going back and forth in playing. We'll have to hear you speak some more, just to make sure that we can still hear you well. I think somehow it's still worse than it was before. Somehow
Strange.
it was working rather perfectly until now.
I'll see what I can fudge with.
Yes, perhaps again. I think if you just go to the preferences in audio and raise up the microphone level, because maybe it calibrated to music. But I think this is most fascinating, and so many directions in which one wants to ask you in. And there is a question from one of our pianists, Alexander Gajiv. What are the kind of harmonical principles you follow in your music? Beautiful work, thank you. And it's true that now we get to query you about all sorts of things, and not only about text. But for example, I too was struck by, just trying to find it in your score. For example, I mean, there's obviously a lot of harmonic progressions everywhere. But there was a section in the first song that I also wanted to know. So how is this working? And I guess the question, one of the questions to you as a composer now, not only about text for a second. I think it's that section on the bottom of the page here. Are you and in some way it connects to the Boulez article too. So how are you living with notes coming into harmonies as a composer in the 21st century? And how are you coming up with things that sound tonal yet don't move necessarily quite how our great grandmother taught?
So I think I see where the microphone is low, and I'm trying to change it. It's not letting me. I think my microphone has a bad impression of my performance just now, so it wants to keep me very soft. I don't know if you can raise my volume, KIRILL.
I'm not sure, but if you would click where it says do you have this automatically adjust microphone volume?
Is this better?
Yes.
There it is. Okay. Good.
Now we'll hear more of your insights. That's very good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a big question. I guess what I would say is, I feel like in my formative time as a musician, I always, I grew up with this notion that there is such a thing as tonal music, and there's such a thing as atonal music, and there's a big gulf in between. And I feel like as I've grown up, I believe less and less in that gulf. Where I acknowledge that I'm coming from a place of working with materials that sound tonal. I feel like something that I think we have in common, KIRILL, is that I have something of a jazz background, and spent a lot of time in high school playing jazz piano and playing in a rock band and doing all kinds of things. I'm sure I never got anywhere close to your level pianistically, but it was a big part of my musical formativeness. So I think, this is something that we Americans have too, is that I think we have a really deep sense of groove. We have a really deep sense of pulse. All of those trains in Duke Ellington and everybody else, it's really deep in our bones that music has a groove, even if you interrupt it. And I think there's also a certain kind of innocence that comes with being an American composer, because so much of the great 20th century American music in jazz and in other fields has a much more kind of innocent relationship to the materials of tonality than maybe our European counterparts did, where there was a certain guilt complex and it was complicated. Let's put it that way. And so I remember feeling really pretty agonized about that as a student composer, feeling like, am I just a sucker? Am I just a schmaltzy sucker for using these materials? Should I be, Brian Fernyhough instead? And at a certain point, I felt like, this is mother's milk to me. This stuff they're just my materials. They're what I grew up with. So it has to be my starting point. You don't always get to choose your starting point, but you do get to choose kind of what you do with it. And for me, a big part of my, compositional practice is synthesizing musical idioms that maybe had not met before. For me, there isn't really a contradiction between a piece beginning in this kind of lyrical mode and then kind of going into a black hole, as the kimono does in the middle. It goes into this kind of strange noise place for 8 bars, and then it kind of takes a deep breath and emerges again. This is a rambly and kind of wide-ranging answer, but I guess it would be to say that I don't have any principles that I could write down, but I embrace kind of starting with tonal materials because I think they offer, for me, the widest expressive possibilities, and then following them wherever they lead, whether that's somewhere very explosive or noise-based or wherever.
Fascinating. There is, in the meantime, a question that has come in from Christopher Peacock, the British philosopher, who says, Fred Lerdow tries to extend his analysis of music to poetry itself, and it does not recognize any significance for line breaks in the poems. This would be a radical error on your approach, with which I'm sympathetic. We couldn't get your good points off the ground unless the prosodic analysis of the poem has an autonomy independent of the apparatus of his musical analysis. Would you also like to comment on the significance of line breaks in the poetry for the composer?
This is a really good question. Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, I mean, I would say that a line break is essentially a bar line. I think there's a lot of similarity in the function of a line break and a bar line. Historically too, in the sense that before the 20th century, or it's a bit different maybe because I think in music it changed a bit earlier, in the mid 19th century maybe. But the bar line used to really mean something. It used to, or rather it used to automatically mean something in terms of what the phrasing was and what the character was. And similarly, line breaks in poetry tended to be quite regular, or if they were irregular, they fitted into a symmetrical, larger system. And then in similar ways, with a lot of contemporary music, you couldn't always tell where the bar line is. You can't always tell if you're listening to a Burt Whistle piece or whatever, that sometimes you really have to look at the score and you go, I wonder, that's a fantastic effect. I wonder how he or she notated it. Whereas in older music, you don't usually think that. You basically could transcribe it. And similarly in poetry, I think the bar line has become, an emblem of instability or rupture. But I think that your question is also about how do musicians respond to the bar lines in poetry, which is complicated because I think it has something to do with what I said about the the time signature. You have to acknowledge that it's there, but you can't be a slave to it. You can't obey it always. I'm trying to think in the examples that I gave. I guess in the Verdi, he does let you know where the line breaks are. You feel that in the music, but Stravinsky really doesn't. You look throughout Rake's Progress or other vocal music, and he will sometimes put a break. That's it's become my gesture today for break, I guess. He'll put a break in the middle of a line, so it's just it's. I would say that it has the same relationship between poetry and music as meter does.
But with Stravinsky, generally, this kind of ongoing disfigurement is very Picasso-like. No, it's sort of just it's become
Yes.
somewhere between a stroke of genius and eventually almost a tick. That it's so whatever is on the beat is off the beat, and whatever is off the beat is on the beat or elsewhere somehow.
Yeah. It's a tick that I'm grateful for. It gave us a lot of great music.
Yeah, no, I'm being insolent, but of course it's genius, and it's actually one of the consistent and constant things throughout Stravinsky changing his stylistic clothes. But this
Mm-hmm.
kind of displacement seems to be with him from circa 1907 until 1966.
Yeah, I
Um,
would agree with that.
And and as far as well, notation and bar lines, something also to ask you as a composer, because it's so well. How is this notated, and something that sounds like it's on the beat, but it's off the beat, or that's a suggestion to ignore? Would you agree that often you composers put things not where the performer would necessarily expect them, in order to, in the good sense, make the performer also feel off kilter, which seems to be often the case.
Well, I mean, I try not to be too sadistic. I'm not trying to make the performer,
Yeah,
uh,
not for artful purposes, not for making complicated notation, but
it's a good question. I mean, this also gets back to the question of groove and the kind of how you think about what a bar is. You know, I had a good I have a good friend who is a wonderful drummer, and growing up, it was always kind of a game of like find where one is in whatever complicated music you're listening to, which I think is a very jazz or rock based way of thinking about things, because um, it assumes that there is some kind of steady pulse. But for me, I think I have a really deep internal sense of what a pickup is and what a pickup means. And so for me, if you were to take the same bit of music um, and you were to re-notate it so that a pickup were a downbeat, even if it would sound the same, for me, it would feel as wrong as if it suddenly had a bunch of wrong notes in it. It's for the definition of what a pickup is feels like the definition of what an A sharp is. It's really, so I guess I try to think about that in notation. Is it's at a very physical level of like, what am I feeling? Um, is this gesture, um, is it ongoing, or is it kind of self-interrupting? Pieces that have a lot of bars that are just in one, like 1/4 or 1/8 or whatever, the composer is asking you to kind of restart. We're talking about Stravinsky a lot, but I think Stravinsky sort of invented, in a way, this kind of ecstatic obliteration effect, where the music seems to restart from nothing over and over again. And that's a fantastic effect. It has to be deployed very, purposefully.
mm, actually, since we're really luckily and happily digging into the fundaments and the fundamentals of music. So you said groove, and it's something that often I'll use in conversation with musicians or students. It's something that one of my teachers, Mr. Radosh, often talks about, so the groove. But then, so the innocent question: how would you define it? What is a groove?
Hmm.
I mean, I think I sort of have some vague ideas, but now if I am the innocent student, I would say, well, say groove, but what is groove?
Phew. It's an extremely hard question.
I mean, I should have emailed it in advance.
No, I mean, it's funny. My first thought is, because the word groove does mean kind of digging a space, making a mark. You can make a groove in a piece of wood. In a way, that's what groove is for me. It's this carving out a space. It's a very physical thing of kind of feeling like you're sinking into the earth. So there's a sense of weight to it. I guess maybe this is totally spur of the moment, but my definition of pulse or groove for the moment is groove is pulse that respects the weight of the music, the sonic weight of the music. Is that when something has a really fantastic groove, you feel like it's digging in. But I'm sure I'd revise that if I thought about it for 5 minutes.
We can keep that out there in our future correspondence. And you would say, or would you say that it's also a recurring thing? The groove has a certain,
Yes.
So it has a recurrence pattern.
Yeah, like a heartbeat, for sure.
Yeah. And then now, so from recurrence, my thought jumps to Schoenberg, and there is that famous phrase from him where he said that it seems that, paraphrased, but that it seems that for music to be coherent, there needs to be a certain degree of repetition. Do you feel that, and in your music, is this a conscious thing, or it just happens? And to which extent do you think repetition is needed? And then we can very soon jump to Boulez and your piece, and how much can we receive there.
It's almost ironic that it would be Schoenberg who would say that. I think to me that sounds like one of the things that Schoenberg said when he was very aware that he'd created a monster in a way with the 12-tone system, because of course it's based on non-repetition. It's based on the idea of a sequence of the 12 chromatic tones that do not repeat. I mean, Schoenberg was never quite as obsessed with non-repetition as Webern was, but I think Webern takes music in a way to an extreme of non-repetition. But for me, Webern is one of the greatest composers. I mean, I love the feeling of the music just kind of going up in smoke. There's something that was actually in the Boulez book that I think we'll discuss, but this thing that Webern said, apparently, which was that he had this feeling that when all 12 tones have gone by, the piece is over. And that's a real crisis, right? That's like a real, not crisis even in a totally bad sense, but that's the extreme. This feeling that once you've presented your materials, that's all you can do. So I admire that. It's like being a monk and living off of a crust of bread every day. But I feel like the antidote to that had to be minimalism in a really extreme form. And minimalism's become a million different things, but for me, the most useful thing about it is that it makes you really, really hyper aware of change. And so for me, it's not so much how I compose a full piece, but sometimes as an exercise, I will literally take one rhythmic gesture or even a chord, a very familiar chord, and I will just sit in it until I feel that it wants to change, and just repeat it like a crazy person until you get the sense that it needs to change. And the thing that I find helpful about that exercise is that whenever the change comes, it's usually not the change that you expected. And it's maybe not the change that would have happened if you just repeated it 4 times and then changed. I've written only a couple of pieces that really are based on that. There's actually a piece for 2 pianos called Finery Forge, which is, there's just this kind of obsession with a G sharp minor chord at the beginning. Also, I wrote it for very young pianists, so I felt that it was kind of fun to let them pound away for like 5 minutes at the beginning. And there's the middle movement of a piece for violin and piano that I wrote is based on a kind of, D flat major is just kind of the universe. It's just like that chord is the atmosphere. So I guess what I would boil this down to is that repetition is most valuable as a means of defamiliarization. It's the same way that if you repeat a word enough times, the word becomes this foreign object. It's the same with musical repetition.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And so you spoke about the groove as also a very physical sensation, which I agree, and I also often say to in lessons that we use so many words to talk about music because that's the only inefficient means of communication that we have. Yet it's a kind of a biological feeling. Would you say that you have also this biological feeling in terms of the larger form in pieces that that it's a sense of, okay, for example, Olli Nassen, remember, told me that that's how he perceived form in his pieces, that it's sort of, okay, we've had this for a while, now it's time to have something else for a while, and eventually that a piece is like a series of body states, so to say. Is that how you think about it? You don't think about it, or how is form arisen in your music, in your larger scale things?
It's a great question. I would say it's a bit different in opera and in large-scale instrumental music. And most recently, the most recent large-scale piece that I wrote is an opera, so I'm kind of in that headspace. But it's very physical, always. I mean, sometimes I think you write towards a particular point. You have one musical idea and you think, oh, well, that can't be the beginning. So what is it? How do I get there? And the whole form of the piece can become this kind of journey to figure out how you end up in one particular place that you want to be. And sometimes the opposite happens, and you start with just an idea that is the beginning, and you get lost and found along the way. It is very physical. I mean, I wish I had Olli Nassen's instinct for it. I mean, he has an amazing instinct for it. The difference in opera, I feel, is that a lot of the form is given to you in the form of the libretto, and so it's easier, frankly. It's a little bit of a cop-out because you know where the big events are. Your job, if you believe in the text, your job is basically to just make it happen. So I think I'm due to challenge myself with an big instrumental piece, which is much harder.
Mm. And so speaking about that, it's easier with the text. And I think as an interpreter, I feel that, well, I have many commiserations with singers and carrying your instrument, all the difficulties that involves. But on the other hand, sometimes it does feel that interpretively, it's so much more obvious to push from the text. Well, the text changes. Well, of course, you play this harmony differently. Whereas with instrumental music, it's so much more abstract. Now, when you're setting text to music, I think one of the things I was curious about, aside from the rhythm, that was absolutely fascinating to hear you speak about, but that balance I imagine you need to strike between being suggestive and illustrative in the music as to what the text suggests, and or ignoring the suggestions, or working against the suggestiveness. Because, I mean, thank God I'm not a composer, but I imagine that would be a temptation and potential pitfall.
It is. I mean, it's a pitfall to do it so obviously that the piece might as well not exist. Because if it's the exact same, then you might as well just read the text. And if you're completely just going to subvert it, you know, then what's the point? If it's literally just the opposite. I guess, yeah, I would answer by saying that I always look for texts that feel a little bit unfinished, or that feel that music can expand them or add on to them. You know, you look at what a composer like Gerald Barry did with The Importance of Being Earnest, the Oscar Wilde. He basically exploded it. I mean, but all of these, Gerald Barry's music is very kind of manic in a certain way. It has a very fast, natural tempo, and of course, in that case, all of the kind of social anxiety and repressed feelings of various kinds, it's totally there in the play, but it's there in the play in this kind of silent, under the surface way. And what he did is he brought it to the surface and made it the texture, the basic atmosphere, which I think is great. I think that's, you know, he found something that was latent or invisible and made it visible. So I'm always looking for that quality. I'm not looking to ignore what the text has to say, and I'm also not looking to do exactly what it seems to say. I'm looking for an unfinishedness.
So one could say that there's potentially a text too perfect and self-enclosed to set to music.
That's a question. Is there one?
Yeah, well, so one could therefore theorize if the attractive ones are sort of the somewhat unfinished ones, or ones that don't quite finish saying what there is to say. Could one say that then there are texts that are nearly immune to successful setting them to music because they're so self-enclosed?
I would say so, yes. But I would, you know, I don't want to point to specific ones because maybe some other composer could do a great job with it, and it's just my blindness. But I think there are, yes.
Yes, and yeah, so many directions. In the meantime, there's a question also from Alexander Gajiev. Do you often use improvisation as a tool for creating your musical material, or does it all start abstractly? And I think
that's a good question.
How do you still improvise, also considering your jazz background, and is composition a sort of an evolved improvisation, or what is it for you?
Well, I think I have the same question for you, Kirill. But to answer first, I guess I would say yes. Composition feels a lot like improvisation for me. I do work at the piano. I've always been a little bit suspicious of this sort of very common composition lesson thing of you should not compose at the piano because people seem afraid that you might accidentally recompose Chopin or something just because it feels familiar in your fingers, which I've never felt that way. I always feel actually that I can explore more when it's physical. And, you know, I think there's pretty good evidence, I think we've talked a lot about Stravinsky today. You know, Stravinsky always composed at the piano and had a sort of physical connection. And, you know, Tom Ades, I think, works the same way. And I think there are certain composers that I don't want to name, but who were really insistent about never working at the piano. And for me, sometimes the voicings don't feel quite as special. So yeah, early on, it's a very physical, improvisatory thing. Do you still keep in touch with that side of your playing, Kirill?
Periodically, I mean, it seeps through the cracks of the day and the practice. That always was the case. I mean, I do feel that jazz is as much a language as classical music, that you need to sort of live and boil in for 25 hours a day. So I take it. I feel too seriously about it to do it too haphazardly, but it's somewhere there as a language that you and I spoke early on. And speaking about languages, so well, and it's very impressive. You recite and sing in Italian and in German, obviously in English. Um, Not to say that I'm asking this only because Russian is my mother tongue, but have you had experience with Russian opera? And I'm sure at least you've looked at, let's say, text settings of, to pick one, Tchaikovsky. And so, what I'm curious about your observations of differences of how composers whose mother tongue is a certain language, how they differ with each other. Obviously, not just their individualities, but sort of what does language perception do to the musical meter? Let's say. I mean, I know one could say let's have a 3 week long conference and a book about it, but some scattered thoughts.
Yeah, that is a very big question. I mean, to the question about Russian repertoire, I really don't speak Russian. I sort of kind of pronounce it. When I was working as a an opera house pianist and assistant, I actually worked on 2 productions of Shostakovich's The Nose, first in Rome and then at the Met in New York. I remember, I I finished up the Rome production and I thought, well, that's over with. Thank God I'll never have to play that piece at the piano again. And then the Met thing came about that week. So I think that piece is pretty deep in my head. And I have also conducted Eugene Onegin, Tchaikovsky, at Juilliard Opera, and that was a really happy experience. I love, I really do love Onegin. The Nose was really fun. I mean, it was, especially in Rome, it was just an incredible cultural experience because the cast has like 85 characters. It's a gigantic cast, and the cast of singers, they came from everywhere. I mean, there were Russian singers, Georgian singers, singers from Ukraine, as well as Spanish, Italian, German, just every imaginable thing. So I don't feel like I can speak to Russian specifically because I don't know the language deeply enough. But I will say that for the languages that I know better, and maybe Kirill, you can speak to this relationship with Russian, but I think languages open up certain possibilities and close off possibilities as well. English sort of has a bad reputation as a language to sing in because we have all these strange vowel sounds that, I mean, you can hear me right now. It's like there are vowel sounds that are in between, there are diphthongs, and it's kind of ugly. And but I think actually that same quality is what makes English such a great language for poetry, because it is tough and it's a mutt. It's if it were a dog, it would be a mutt. That's a million different breeds, and so it's very rich. And I'm grateful to it as a composer because I think my music has some of that rhythmic toughness and stickiness. So English is a very good language. Italian, of course, it's wide open. It's the most perfect language for singing in, but that has its own limitations. French is maybe the most interesting, and this also relates to Boulez. a teacher of mine who was raised speaking French once said something so fascinating, which was that she felt that she thought that French poets had been fighting the French language for 1,000 years, trying to make it anything but sweet. And for me, that is so revealing, not just about French poetry, but I think also about French music, that there is this essential sweetness to the texture that is so beguiling, but it's really hard to change. It's really hard to rupture it. And sometimes you find composers, French composers, who I think are trying to break the texture, but there's something in the language that it stays kind of sweet. And I think that actually is the case in some of Boulez's music. He talks a lot about violence and surprise, but I don't always feel it. I end up feeling that even when it's violent on the surface, it has this smoothness and sheen to it. So yeah, it's a mysterious relationship.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember Zoltan Kocsis, the great Hungarian pianist, saying that that he felt, well, that Hungarian language influenced the sense of accenting in his playing, not only of Hungarian music, and that he said that when he would be for a few weeks outside of Hungary and away from the Hungarian language, that he would actually feel that his biological sense of music was sort of less stable or less identified with that, and would start to float away. Which I don't. It sounds fascinating. I don't know if I can truly say, well, I experience a similar thing, but as a concept, that's.
I mean, do you think there's a connection between the way that Russian functions as a language and the sort of Russian schools of musical thought?
I would imagine, but it's a little bit like the question that I'm sure you get asked also, has jazz influenced you and how?
Right, yeah.
It's like, well, yes, it has, but it's going to be very hard to point to specific examples and say, A equals S in that context. But I would imagine, yes, and I think there is a certain rhymey quality to Russian poetry, which is absolutely glorious, and so perhaps sometimes this kind of rhyming you hear very strongly in Tchaikovsky's and Rachmaninoff's music. That is then sometimes criticized as a sort of symmetry to the Western ear, that it's in some way too peaceful, that the things complete and correspond in this way. But one of those. Who knows? But since we've mentioned Boulez several times, at least this month or last month, this is the elephant in the room. But maybe also not this month, but this past who knows how many years or decades. Compliments on your article for the NYRB. Are you getting hate mail?
No, I was sort of expecting, the ghost of Milton Babbitt to show up at my house and yell at me. But no, I what I have gotten, it's been extraordinary actually. The responses to that article. A lot of composers, interestingly, kind of wrote to say, yeah, I kind of feel that way too. I think I told you it felt a bit like I was, talking about an abusive uncle or something that was always the family secret. But I also got some very touching personal reminiscences from people, music fans around the world who knew Boulez. And, I don't doubt that he was a lovely human being in many circumstances. I was entirely responding to a book. But there were some very funny stories. There was one, from a viola player in a great orchestra that had worked with Boulez, and I guess they had done a piece of the repertoire that has a really prominent viola soli section, and at the end of the concert, at Carnegie, there was no bow for the section. And I guess with the help of a couple of drinks, this player felt confident enough to say to Boulez at the dinner afterwards, if that had been a horn solo, you totally would have given the horns section a solo bow. And apparently Boulez said, you chose to play viola, that's your problem. So even he has viola jokes up his sleeve. So it's been really nice, a kind of spirited response. And I didn't really intend it as just a kind of takedown. I wanted to engage with his writing on music, because people always talk about it being kind of intimidatingly brilliant, and his ear and his mind. And I just found myself thinking, I cannot penetrate what some of these things mean, and I'm just going to put it out there that I'm not sure they have this meaning that I'm not accessing. So yeah, it's been interesting.
No, it's wonderful, and it's a great approach. One thing we haven't, well, as a 150 things we haven't covered, but one thing we haven't covered from your activities is, in addition to being the excellent composer that you are, you're also a prominent conductor, and I want to talk about that a little bit, also about your time in Chicago, since if we're talking about Boulez. And I know your bio says that you worked with Maestro Muti. This was during the Chicago time. Was this also in Rome for the?
Briefly, but it was basically a Chicago connection, yeah. And
this is somebody that's obviously very engaged with words and music, or particularly Italian words and music. What are some of the distillations that you take away from that experience, from him and from that experience?
I learned a lot from studying with Muti. It was not, it was not a lot of one-on-one conducting lessons. It was more kind of learn by example, and we would check in briefly occasionally. One thing that I found very funny was that we would mostly speak in Italian, but I realized near the end of my 2 years there that he actually literally was not aware that we were speaking in Italian, because he gave me this piece of advice that if you're going to be a real conductor of opera, you have to learn Italian. And I sort of said, we're speaking Italian, which is funny to me that, you can get to that point of actually not being aware. I learned a lot about how to do less as a conductor. I think that's a good way of saying it. I'm still fairly young in musician years, and I'm also American, and my background is not in this hyper formal classical. When I was in my really young years, I was playing other kinds of music, and my nature is to be friendly and informal. And it was really helpful actually to work with someone who follows a certain kind of code of how he is with orchestras and in every kind of public setting. Not that I would ever, it's not who I am. I would look ridiculous if I got onto a podium and tried to, put on airs. But it was something about the atmosphere that he creates in rehearsals was really helpful. And also at a technical level, he's he's got to be close to 80 at this point. And his conducting style has become quite amazing in how minimal it is. He always talked about, having the most control with your wrist, not with your arm, not with your fingers, but just the flexibility of your wrist. And it's astonishing what he can do. Again, I don't need to imitate it. I'm not 80 years old. So yeah, I think I learned a lot, in part because he's very different from me.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I've heard him talk about talk about the wrist. I do find that he's one of the conductors that plays an instrument just the way a virtuoso violinist or pianist would play their instrument. So it's whatever he plays actually takes place, which is.
And I'm assuming you've worked with him as a soloist.
Yes, it was great honor and great pleasure. And I do remember he was very kind to me from the first moment, but the first upbeat he gave me in the concert, and I knew when to enter. I was Scribe in Prometheus, and I knew when to enter, and I was going to enter. But still, the authority of the look was, I thought, my God, if I don't play now, my head will be cut off. It was clear. But it was wonderful because it was so, the imperative of a great conductor.
And he really cares. I hope he wouldn't mind my saying this because I really do mean it as a compliment. But one thing that amazed me was that I feel like I could see at the beginning of a rehearsal or a concert, I could actually see nervousness just in his eyes. Of course, he's completely in control and calm, but just there's this. It's kind of beautiful actually to stay. To be aware of how it matters. And, some conductors, they get to a certain point and there's a sense of like, you're good, I'm good, it's going to be fine. And he doesn't have that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I sense that as well. That was a question not to omit asking this question from Stuart Kaufman. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem introduced much of the English-speaking world to Wilfred Owen's poetry and defined its interpretation. Can you discuss other notable examples when the composer has in effect introduced and defined the poetry and its meaning?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like there are a couple of obvious examples that are going to slip my mind, where the poem almost is forgotten because people only know the song.
I mean, I hope I'm not being too sacrilegious, but I think much of Goethe's poetry is heard today through the lens of Schubert. I mean, leaving Faust aside and leaving professional scholars, but I think Schubert keeps Goethe in sort of everyday circulation.
Yeah, it's true. We, especially in English-speaking countries, we don't read that much Goethe, but we play plenty of Schubert. I know I'm forgetting a really obvious one here, but no other ones are occurring to me.
we can keep it in reserve in case something comes. And if we're slightly tracking back to predecessors of Boulez, and so in some way to Schoenberg, what I'm struck about or struck by that for example, in Schoenberg, that the note choice gets eventually rather adventurous and eventually relatively incomprehensible for a lot of people, at least on the fly. But how come you think the metric placement remains so incredibly traditional? Because if you take many of Schoenberg's adult pieces, including let's say the piano concerto, the notes are pretty much out there. But if you would erase the notes, the actual notes, the placement, it's very much sort of Marche Militaire, Viennese. It's not very far from Schubert and Beethoven, to exaggerate slightly. And it just seems strange that it would be so lopsided that they would that there would be such a concentration in the choice of the notes, but the timing of the notes is pretty traditional. Or do you think I see it incorrectly?
No, I completely agree. I think it gets to the Schoenberg Stravinsky axis in a certain way, in terms of what was being innovated upon throughout the 20th century. You look at like the ways that Adorno, in my opinion, missed a lot of the great things that Stravinsky was doing, because just the way that his mind was wired, it was like he's not innovating harmonically in these ways that I'm expecting him to, and therefore it must be bad. Whereas, you know, the rhythmic innovation that was happening is amazing. And I think I would relate it back to this thing of groove that we've touched on a couple of times. And also something that feels to me particular to American music. Just because American music is younger, it kind of came into its own much later. It's much more closely connected to machines and the industrial age and the whole idea of a rhythmic grid that's based on how a train moves or industrial rhythms. So there's a different sense of precision. And I think if you have a mental wiring that is based on that kind of precision, then the rhythmic experiments that you make are very different. And in some ways they're more advanced because you're starting from a place of pulse. Whereas I think Schoenberg comes from a tradition of rubato, you know, a different kind of, a basic rhythmic sense that is very different. And in a way, I guess I would say that he was so busy focused on harmonic innovations that he wasn't taking the same kind of leaps with his rhythms. It's related to, I swear you can tell when an orchestra was founded by the way that they play certain rhythms. You know, were they founded after the Industrial Revolution or before? You know, American orchestras have this sense of pulse that's very modern, and an orchestra like Vienna, it's very sort of squishy. Of course they can play precisely if they want to, but the lizard brain is still in this other place. And I think it was still there for Schoenberg.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. You mentioned several times, and this could be, of course, the next 2 hours, and eventually I should let you get on with your day. But you've mentioned several times, so American music. I think it's obvious that there was, even still is, but was for a long time, a big tension between popular music, jazz, and music that has some more American roots, whatever we define that as, and sort of the American version of the imported European classical tradition. And I think a very defensive side of that was dismissive, let's say, of jazz. Now I think things have been converging and relaxing. Now, of course, it's very easy for something, for a discussion of cultural appropriation to come up in that sense. Where do you feel yourself? Where do you feel the so-called classical tradition that you represent and the jazz tradition that you've been steeped in? Where does that all reside for you, and how do you navigate it, and how do we navigate it now in, let's say, this hypersensitive climate socially that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, it's a layered question.
Sorry.
No, it's a great
but
one.
I better layer it than flatten it.
It's look, cultural appropriation is real and it's a real risk, but there is also such a thing as loving tribute and, you know, being grateful to the music that has helped you become who you are. And, you know, it would be a shame for me as I'm a white male musician, but it would really be sad if I were only formed, gebildet by white male musicians. You know, I'm so glad that, there was an interesting, here's a good example. So the American composer George Lewis, great artist, African-American composer, part of the AACM. And he wrote this book, which is a history of that movement. The book's called A Power Stronger Than Itself. And some friends and I read it together this year, musician friends, classical musician friends, because the ensemble that I co-founded, AMOC, American Modern Opera Company, is co-commissioning a piece from George Lewis. So we wanted to really get to know his thinking. And we were talking about the book, and I realized that my friends, who are all essentially classical musicians, the history, and George Lewis talked a lot about jazz in Chicago in the 30s through the 60s, and the way that this kind of avant-garde, classical adjacent musical community emerged out of both the jazz and the classical scenes in Chicago. I realized that my friends were quite new to this idea of there being a canon of largely Black artists. I mean, they weren't new to the idea. Of course, everyone knows who Ellington and Basie and Louis Armstrong and whoever are. But it felt new to really enter the mindset of this canon of largely Black American artists. And I realized that my mind is wired differently, because between the ages of 14 and 17, I was, my high school jazz band the obsession was to get to Wynton Marsalis's essentially Ellington competition every year. So I was sort of raised during that time with the jazz canon and its masters as being like these God figures. And, so I guess this is a long way of saying that music nourishes people in a very messy way across cultural boundaries, and I think it should. But when it comes to my own music, this is kind of a separate issue. I do think actually there's a pretty clear distinction between a jazz way of making music and a so-called classical way. And it doesn't have anything to do with style. It doesn't really have anything to do with the way the music sounds on the surface. For me, it's all about process. It's all about, does the thing that really matters, sorry, let me rephrase that. Is the thing that matters the score or the recording? Or a live performance, an improvisation that just happens once and is recorded. Because, obvious, I'm saying something kind of obvious, but for a piece that we think of as a classical piece, the score is the reference point. There's only one version of a Beethoven symphony, but there's a million recordings. Whereas with, Radiohead, the ultimate reference point is the studio version of the song. There might be covers of it. You might even make a score of it. People have made, Radiohead arranged for piano, but nobody in their right mind would say that score is like the thing. The thing is the recording. So it's a process thing. Are you a score maker or are you a recording maker? And I identify as a score maker. And for me, that's quite a profound distinction. And it cuts through the questions of style, because then you get caught up into these absurdities of being like, well, this piece for orchestra has like a jazz inflection, so it's jazz. And it's like, well, that's not the most helpful conversation to be having for me. It's more about the process.
Right, so I think that's a brilliant distinction. And by the way, whatever has a jazz inflection, as soon as it has a syncope and potentially a lower third, people say, well, that's jazzy.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
but I think he knew a syncope and a flat third well before he knew of jazz. So yes, I think that's a very good distinction between the score making, the recording making. I've often wondered whether that is in fact one of the reasons why jazz mm, stays an improvised art, because when jazz was really coming into being, the recording technology was coming into being. So, if Mozart could be recording improvisations, I'm sure he would have still been a great composer, but just as you are, a score maker. But one has to wonder whether the influence of technology in this case really didn't take the branch in a different direction.
And I'm sure you've seen this too, given that you've had teachers in both fields when you were younger. But one thing I notice is that the difference between the way classical musicians think of recordings as a pedagogical tool versus how jazz musicians think of it is fascinating, because you get someone like, a great musician like Daniel Barenboim saying, don't listen to recordings, that's lazy, go to the score. Whereas in jazz, it's like, listen to the recordings, transcribe this Thelonious Monk solo. That's your homework.
Even though I must say there are other great musicians, with all due respect to Master Barenboim, that do say, listen to the recordings and learn from them. And in fact,
well, that's good.
If one thinks of Carlos Kleiber, who seems to, in his study process, would scour everybody's recordings and know the 273 versions of the Leonora Overture before conducting it. So I'm a bit suspicious of the whole "I don't read books when I write my own."
Right.
So, but this is another discussion. I ask you a final question for today, and I do hope that you'll come back. We already even identified. We won't necessarily declare the theme now, but I think we're brushing against the other topic that you were
right. We are
of interest. So I hope that you will agree to come back, because it's a delight to hear you think and share these thoughts. But one last question for my education. Is there, and returning to the theme of today, is there a book, or what are the books that you'd recommend? What would you recommend to read on the topic of the poetic meter and its translations or relations with the musical meter? Are there some things that were serving as sources for you in your development that discuss these things?
It's a good question. I don't have a resource that's really comprehensive. I don't. I can't think of one. But actually, Auden, in his prose writing, is really smart about it. W.H. Auden. He talks about the process with Stravinsky, and it's really touching stuff, because he's one of the greatest poets of the century, but he's also a total unashamed opera queen. And so there's this very funny sense that he's just so excited to be making an opera. And he talks about how, I think he has this comparison of, the poetry must, like a virgin being sacrificed at the altar, just sort of gives itself up and says, do whatever you want with me, to the composer.
Very Rite of Spring.
Very Rite of Spring. He's working with Stravinsky, of course. And he's really good about translation from one language into another, especially if it's going to be sung. Some of the thorny issues of English specifically. So that's the first one that really comes to mind. I should mention it's not really going to be on this topic, but one of my quarantine projects has been to work on a book, which will hopefully be published about a year from now, about opera and music more generally. So hopefully there will be more details about that by the next time.
You'll have to, well, I think that hopefully will be a next time before then, and then clearly there has to be a time when you come and discuss your book. Listen, it's amazing to talk to you, and I want to hear you play more piano and sing. So I hope you promise that.
Embarrassed to play in front of you, Kirill. It's a little out.
That you'll return, and I want to thank everybody here today, listening, and for the questions, for your participation. There'll still be two more seminars in December, I hope, even though Now one knows what has taken place only post factum, since everything is so up in the air constantly. But hopefully 2 more Wednesdays before Christmas, on the 9th and the 16th, and I'll let you know via the email as to what the exact topics and speakers will be. But for now, I just wanted to thank Matthew and thank everyone. Stay healthy, and Matthew, really a joy to hear you.
Likewise, Kirill. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you. Take care. Good
Take care.
night.